So let's look at the whole issue. If we're looking at analogies, let's look at the whole issue of automotive risk. Look from innovation that actually started, the automation actually started in the early 1800s, which was a surprise in researching the op-ed piece as well as this here, was that it turns out the first patent application for something akin to a seatbelt came in 1860 something, which I thought was sort of an interesting scene. People were barely wrapping their heads around the notion of an engine. And they were already thinking in terms of, well, if you had this belt, this might be useful in keeping you out of trouble. You really didn't see anything explosive in terms of adaptation of the technology. You had plenty of patents filing, a lot of intellectual property that came out from the 50s on, or from the 1850s on. But really it was 1930 before you saw any really significant uptake. And with that, you saw the placement of the first traffic light. You didn't have the laws that made it against the law to run it, but hey, folks figured that the stakes were high enough they were willing to obey it. In the 50s, you had your first offering of seat belts. And in 51, you also had the invention of the first model of airbags. So this stuff's been here a while. You have this idea, the smattering of ideas too, a lot of discussion as to what hazards were existing because of automotive technology. But also, it's kind of a slipshod approach, nothing unified at the same period of time. Then came the 50s and the 60s. And in that, you've got three major influencers. You have a fellow named Kenneth Roberts, who was a congressman over a long period of time. He chaired the House Subcommittee on Automotive Safety in the 50s, he actually convened it. He says that his epiphany occurred when he was rear-ended by someone else on a honeymoon trip, and his mother-in-law, who he says was a bit OCD on these deals, packed their household goods as if they were going on a really rough move, so packed it, in newspaper and padding and so forth. And he was fascinated to find that although the back of the car was totally destroyed, the contents of the boxes and their household goods were still intact. So this inspired him to say, well, what would happen, people get injured and killed in these automotive actions. What would happen if we actually said, let's do the same thing for the people in the cars as well? So started convening committees in the 1950s on safety. It took 10 years before they actually spawned the 65 bill that required safety equipment in all automobiles, and as you'll find is a pattern in legislative remedies, is applied to the US government. In parallel to him was a fellow named William Haddon, who is a physician, public health expert. William Haddon did a piece of work that was considered seminal to the whole area of analyzing safety equipment in automobiles. A thing called Accident Research, talk about inspiring titles, which was published in '64. And it was really the first time that highway safety countermeasures were subjected to anything resembling formal scientific scrutiny. Everything up until then, as I alluded to before, was sort of slipshod. What folks finally think about when they think about automotive safety movements is Ralph Nader. And Ralph actually came on the heels of these other two gentlemen. Ralph was interesting, and Ralph is an attorney. Ralph was very much a crusader. I think he went to law school because he had decided he was going to spend his life doing crusading. And although we think of him first, it's because he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, in which he made a lot of accusations of the automotive industry, and saying effectively the automotive industry did not give a about anything resembling automotive safety. They were going to focus on the performance, and they were going to focus on the glitzy designs, and they were going to focus on everything that had to do anything with the safe usage of those automobiles, and that people were dropping like flies because of it. There are a lot of horrendous deals. So the focus of his attention in Unsafe at Any Speed, which continues to be a bestseller, 40 years later, 50 years later now, was the infamous Chevrolet Corvair. And the Corvair had a flipping issue as well as a badly placed fuel tank, which made it kind of a fireball once it rolled over, as it was more apt to do. He was out there in terms of accusing the corporate realm of not only being negligent, but being deliberately so, being profiteers at the expense of the public. And this sort of dovetailed with the efforts that Roberts had in the legislative realm, and it led to the passage of one of the major, the first major really big pieces of highway safety legislation. It also created a thing called the National Highway Traffic Safety, first administration, now agency, which is a standalone component of the government that does effectively that extends this whole scene to allow government to take a coherent look and do coherent tracking over time of safety statistics. What's worth noting is that before these guys actually did their thing, automotive safety was considered strictly an educational issue. If it was going to be addressed as far as the government was concerned, any safety issue in automotive, no matter how bad the design of the automobile, it was considered to be a driver error or a passenger error, and it was going to be considered from a legal liability point of view, the problem of the driver, never an issue of the manufacturer. Nader and his crusade, as well as some of the other legislation that came through here, kind of blew the doors off that.